Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming along to this webinar this afternoon on advancing marine species density surface modelling. The format for the next few hours will involve a series of presentations by the project team, and we'll have a couple of short breaks in there as well. We'll not be answering questions at the end of each talk, but instead we'll aim to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. So we'll have hopefully at least 20 minutes at the end to answer as many of your questions as we can. I ask you, please submit questions at any time in the next few hours through the chat function. So there should be a speech bubble at the top of the event. You can click on there and you can submit a question, and we'll prepare as many answers as we can in the background over the next few hours, and we'll come back to those. Please note that the webinar will be recorded, and we'll advise all registered participants of where the recording can be viewed following the event. So some of you will have joined us for our first and our second in-person workshops back in Halifax and in Barcelona. But I know there are many more on this call who didn't attend those first two workshops. And so I'm going to pass over to Jason Roberts from Duke University in the first instance, and Jason is going to provide an introduction to density surface modelling. So over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Katrina. So good morning, everybody. If you're on the East Coast time zone where I am, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the rest of the world. I'm going to give a quick intro here to density surface modeling before we get into the DenMod project proper. And so this here is to catch people up who are unfamiliar with this methodology. So I'm originally, my ancestors are originally from Scandinavia, and here is a map of Scandinavia. Humans have been interested for a long time in mapping what's in the ocean. And this map is from about 500 years ago. And I'm going to give my introduction to density surface modeling from the perspective of a marine ecologist, specifically someone who's interested in cetaceans. And so if we look at this ancient map, we can see here that there are a number of species on here that we can identify with today. So for example, here's probably what I would call a baleen whale and calf, and an orca, and a Xiphias or beaked whale. This one here is perhaps a sperm whale, Physeter. And this here might be ambergris. What's written here is Ambra spermaceti. And then here we have what appears to be a whale on the shore with some people perhaps flensing it or carving things out of it. And then if we move a bit further northeast, we can definitely see here what appears to be activity of whaling at sea. And so 500 years ago, we might think that this is the period of time in which we were transitioning from the so-called here be dragons era to kind of more systematic mapping of the ocean. So if we fast forward about 300 years, here we have in the United States a much more systematic map of whales in the ocean. We can see here that this map is showing data across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and it's not even bothering with the Atlantic anymore, perhaps because many of the whales in the Atlantic had perhaps been fished out, so to speak, at this point. This map here is quite sophisticated. So we can see here it's a map that shows multiple species, in this case, sperm whales and right whales. I'm not sure what straggling sperm and straggling right whales are here. We can see that it has an estimate of relative density. Two whales of the same species in a square denote that square is to be much frequented by the species. And it has seasonality. And so this is 150 years ago, what we might be wanting to do today. Well, the story with whales, unfortunately, is that as our mapping ability became more sophisticated, and we did not really realize the finite availability of whales as a resource, whaling became highly industrialized. So here we have a little bit later in the 1800s, the types of products that can be obtained from whales, and then moving into the 20th century. Essentially, we have the same level of technology that might be used in warfare between humans was being propagated on whales. And as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, this led to a situation where whale populations essentially crashed. here in this figure here, we have this red line that shows the establishment of the International Whaling Commission. And this is perhaps, the first major attempt internationally among countries to regulate and manage whales. And then we can see here, towards the 2000s, perhaps around 1986, when whaling by and large was banned by moratorium of the International Whaling Commission, we have some recovery in some of the species, but we still have a long way to go for the species to become fully recovered. And so in the modern era, we're not so concerned with whaling anymore, but perhaps more with other threats such as ship strikes. Here we have baleen whales, which can be hit by large ships or even small recreational vessels can hurt them. We have entanglement in fishing gear. The problem is with large whales like this is they can't detect things like ships or fishing gear very well, and so they can't evade them. Then we have testing and training exercises performed by navies in peacetime. And these necessarily involve, introduction of large amounts of kinetic energy into the water, and this can cause a variety of ill effects. We have other sources of ocean noise, ranging from natural sources such as lightning or storms that the animals may be accustomed to more modern human-based sources of noise, such as shipping noise or oil prospecting, air guns. And then finally, we have climate change. Where I live on the US East Coast, perhaps the biggest example of this that's relevant that I hear about practically on a daily basis is the North Atlantic right whale, which is severely endangered. And because of shifting prey resources linked to climate change, has now shifted its own range into areas that, just 10 years ago, it wasn't expected to be found in. And this is causing additional interactions with humans to the detriment of the species. So what does this mean? Well, in short, we need better maps. We need to know where are they. We need to know how many there are. We would like to know how they move seasonally and ideally where they would go in the future. We need to know how certain we can be about our predictions. And we need to know how to best fill in gaps where we have no data, because of course we can't undertake surveillance of the entire ocean 24/7. And we need to know how to combine data from different observation methods. So for example, from visual and acoustic surveys. And this is particularly important when you have collaborations between different organizations. Inevitably, they can't synchronize their methods and their data collection. And so we need to know how to combine the different types of data that they collect into a unified analysis. So at a high level, this is what we propose be done, or what we have been working on for a number of years. So this method is called density surface modeling. And in short, what it does is take line transect surveys in which you have some observers, usually on a ship or a plane, but it can be an autonomous vehicle without any human observers on board, traversing what's usually a planned out systematic survey and collecting observations of animals that could be visual, they could be acoustic, they could be other modes of sensing, and then combining that with maps of oceanographic or other environmental relevant covariates. They can be linked to those locations where surveying was conducted in a statistical model. And then from that, we want to estimate density maps, where density is the number of individual animals per unit area. And then some maps that characterize the uncertainty that we have in those density estimates. And then, of course, we might also want to estimate total abundance from those data as well. So what I'm going to do now is to walk through the basic workflow for this. This is kind of like what I'd call classic density surface modeling at this point. I'm going to make reference to a figure from this paper here, which is what the paper I would point people to if they're just looking for an introduction to this topic. This isn't kind of the seminal research on this. There are many papers that go back 10 years and perhaps longer that talk about this. But this is a good place to start. So here we have the main figure from this paper. And in the workflow here, we have four basic steps. So we have detection function fitting, And that's where we model how easy it is to detect animals that are seen or heard. Then we have a spatial model. And then after that, we have prediction, in which we want to essentially make our maps. And then we have uncertainty estimation, where we want to summarize our uncertainty about those maps that we've made. So let's look at each of these steps in a little bit of detail. So for detection function fitting, what we're talking about here is this situation where classically animals that are closer to the observer are easier to detect than animals farther from the observer. And so here we have short-beaked common dolphins, and these ones that are right next to the observer here are obviously highly visible. And then we can see maybe a second pair and maybe a third one, and then maybe something in the distance there that could be one or it might not be one. And so in order to account for this change in detectability with distance to the observer, what we do is track the distance to the objects, or in this case, the animals that we've cited. So this is done using several common techniques. So if we have shipboard observers, often they're using binoculars. In the United States and Europe, many surveys are conducted without the use of binoculars like this. In either case, what they're doing is measuring the radial sighting distance to the sighted group of cetaceans in this case, and measuring the angle to them so that the perpendicular sighting distance can be calculated. That's the distance here that shows how far the group was from the transect, or in this case, the direction that the ship was traveling. And that's the important parameter that we're then going to use for building our models. For aerial observers, we have a similar type of thing where we know the altitude of the aircraft, H in this case, and the observers measure the angle out from vertical or the angle down from the horizon. Either one will work. And then from that, we can get the perpendicular sighting distance from the track line as the plane's proceeding over the water out to the cetacean group. And then another mode that's becoming increasingly more common is to use acoustic monitoring. And in this mode, hydrophones are towed behind the survey vessel. And as the vessel proceeds along its track line, multiple bearings are gathered to the animal. You can see that over here in this figure. And then from that, essentially the location of the animal can be triangulated, and then the perpendicular distance calculated. This mode is interesting because it presumes that the animal is consistently vocalizing. And if the animal's not consistently vocalizing, then you need to apply some correction factors to account for that fact. So as the survey vessel progresses across the study area, some animals that are present are sighted, and some animals that are present are not sighted, or are heard or not heard. And as we gather these data, they end up forming a characteristic shape where close to the survey vessel or aircraft or platform here, we can see that there's many detections that are made, and then there are relatively few detections that are made at farther distances away. And so this kind of takes on a characteristic shape, a bell curve or Gaussian, half Gaussian curve. And so the idea here is we can model the shape of that curve empirically from these data. And what that represents is the probability of making a detection integrated over, whatever distance you choose for your analysis. So in this case, this particular analysis chose a distance of 0.025 units. That might be, 25 meters or something like that from the survey transect line. And so as you get further away, probability of detection is lower. And what this is doing is accounting for the animals that presumably are there but were not detected. So that allows us to then correct for that effect of animals that we're not seeing. In addition to distance, covariates can also be used. So for example, in this case, we have a plot here that, that is showing some real data. This is from, I believe, data from the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And we have, we're showing the effect of the ocean sea state here measured on the Beaufort scale, where at Beaufort 0, represented by these dots up here, this curve might be formed, but at Beaufort 5 down here, this curve might be formed. And so it's basically showing that as the sea gets rougher, detectability becomes harder. So once we've modeled detection, we've kind of started with our surveys here and we've modeled our detection function, then we can proceed to the next step. And so next what we need to do is to correct for any biases in the availability of animals for detection. And so two classic biases that come up and are usually attempted to be corrected for if possible are what's called availability bias. And so for visual surveys, what this means is the animal is not available to be seen because it's under the water. And so it's present, but no matter how hard you try and see it, you can't, because it's, you know, in this case of a sperm whale, could potentially be, you know, hundreds of meters underwater. And so here we have three examples of sperm whales, pilot whales, and orcas showing their different levels of availability, where sperm whales are long, deep divers, pilot whales a little bit less so, and orcas even less than that. And the other classic bias that we try and correct for is often called perception bias. And this is no matter how hard you try and see an animal, even when it's directly on the track line, it's just too hard to see. And so you only end up detecting it some of the time. So here I'm just showing a couple of pictures where perhaps the seal might be hard to see from a ship as compared to a large cetacean like an orca. And so the typical procedure for correcting for this is you estimate availability bias correction factor from diving data and a perception bias correction factor using a method that lets you estimate how frequently you see animals directly on the track line. So in the literature, the common method that's used is called Mrds, mark recapture distance sampling. And this involves using an independent observer team, so you have two teams of data to work with. And then you multiply these correction factors together and either reduce the area that you surveyed by this factor, or alternatively inflate the count of animals observed by that factor to account for the ones that you didn't see. Then after that, you take the survey data and you split it up into segments. And so traditional way to do that is to take the transect line and to split it periodically into segments of some predefined length, like say 10 kilometers or something. You can instead also intersect your data with a fishnet grid and instead have grid cells in which the data have been summarized or aggregated, I mean. And then from that, you link up environmental covariates at the segments. So here you have to intersect the segments with whatever data you would use for modeling. So for example, the depth of the seafloor, sea surface temperature. Ideally, you would have prey fields. And then from that, you fit a model that uses the detections of the animals on the transect line as the response variable. So in other words, the number of animals you found on the segment, and then the covariates as the model covariates, and then relate the two. So typically we use generalized additive models for doing that, but that's, in theory, you could use any type of statistic for that. Then finally, you extract covariate grids for the study area. This is when you want to do prediction. So you put those predictions and pump them through the fitted model that you made, and you get as a result the density map, and then you can also estimate uncertainty. And so I've skipped over a whole lot of details in this process because we're going to talk extensively about some of these in detail coming up in subsequent presentations. And then finally, after you have your predictions, often your predictions aren't just for a single moment in time. So in other words, it's not for, say, a particular month or a particular day, but you have a collection of predictions that are made over a long period of time. And so usually when you're delivering results to be used for decision making, you don't end up delivering the entire full collection of predictions that were made. Usually decision makers have a hard time utilizing a whole collection of predictions like that. And so some summarization is necessary. And so this is an important area of complexity that is challenging, particularly if you're trying to summarize uncertainty. And so we'll have a little bit of discussion about that as well. All right, so that wraps up this presentation. Trina, do you want to take back over?
Sure, thanks very much, Jason. I'm now going to pass over to Len Thomas from the University of St Andrews, and he's going to provide a summary of the DenMod project and the main research areas that were a focus of the project over the last 4 years. So I'll pass over to you, Len.
Thanks very much, Katrina, and hello everybody. Good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. So as Katrina said, I'm going to give a summary of the DenMod project, sort of starting with some motivation, then telling you what we set out to do, what we did do, and if you have questions about it, I'll cover some things in very little detail. So if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll come back to them at the end of all of the talks. Okay, so let's start with some motivation then. Jason's given a really great introduction to some of the things that density surface models can do. So a motivation for us is that reliable estimates of density are needed by lots of parties, but in particular for us, the Navy, and I'll tell you why that there was a big motivation in a minute. And the primary source of information is these visual line transects, either from ships or from planes. There's some photo ID, which we didn't use in this project, and I'll talk about when we talk about what next. There is a future role for remote data collection, which I'll also talk about. So that's either acoustic or from photo. And there's a potential role for citizen science data here and telemetry data, particularly for pinnipeds. A lot of the visual line transect data that's there is appropriate for cetaceans, but much less so for pinnipeds. And the standard analyses that people do on line transect data give you stratum-based estimates. So over big regions, they tell you on average what the density is. So unlike density surface models have the advantage of producing, for example, nice maps like we have on the right hand side here. But the problem is that when you go from these big survey blocks to modeling density as a function of covariates, then you really rely on the model for the accuracy of the estimates, and those estimates of density can then be quite badly biased if the models aren't good. You know, there's a classic thing that statisticians say, which is the results are only as good as the model. And the problem is that there are lots of modeling approaches that are possible on these data. I give some jargon there. And the results can substantially differ sometimes between the methods, particularly when there isn't a lot of data to go on. And very much in particular when you're extrapolating from an area where you have lots of survey data, for example, close to the coast here, out to areas that are further away from where the data are. Then the different modeling methods can give extreme examples of very different results. What's more, the relative merits of the different methods is sometimes unclear, or it certainly was at the beginning of this project. So we don't know which method is best. Also, within some of the methods, there are some unresolved issues, which I will talk about a little bit more. Also, some of these methods are rather complicated, and people who want to apply them find them hard to use. There aren't the tools available, or the tools are rather hard to use, or they don't work in some cases. So that's a barrier to their use. And so all of these issues made us think that it was time to have some concerted effort trying to push the science of density surface modeling forward, and that gave rise to this DenMod project. which was a working group of scientists who are developing methods and those, so statisticians and practitioners who are using the methods to get together to discuss these issues, discuss solutions, and try and implement some of them. So who are these people? Well, you've met Katrina already, and you're hearing me now. So we were the leads at St Andrews University. The other university involved was Duke University, and Pat Halpin was the lead there. The main researcher on the project, the person with most of their time on the project, was Dave Miller. Here's a picture of him. You'll hear from him later. And I want to take the chance to pay tribute to Dave, who did an amazing job of kind of bringing us all together and both doing some excellent methodological work, but also sort of explaining to us more practical people, you know, what he was doing, the advantages and so on, and being able to speak both the statistical language and human beings language, you might say. There were other research staff with time on the project, in particular Rob Schick, Jason Roberts, Laura Minocci, Anna Cañadas and Tina Yak at Duke, and Phil Boucher here in St Andrews. I've put in bold here people that you will meet sometime in the next few hours as part of the webinar. You've met Jason already. And then there's the working group, which was all people from NOAA, and these are people from all of the 5 fisheries science centres. So we were very lucky to get basically the experts from NOAA from all of the science centres together. And in particular, you'll hear from Karen Forney and Doug Sigourney later. The project ran for 5 years. We're just wrapping up now, and this is what we looked like at our first working group meeting at the Halifax Marine Mammal meeting. We had a few days beforehand, and a public meeting that some of you might have come to. And then with COVID happening, this is kind of what the get-togethers looked like at the end, so rather more virtual, unfortunately. Our funding, so this was our Navy focus. The funding came from the US Navy through the Chief of Naval Operations, but also through a lawsuit settlement, so the CERTAS LFA settlement. It was managed by the LMR program, Living Marine Resources program of the US Navy. And I want to particularly thank Anu Kumar and Mandy Schumacher of LMR for their support in pushing things forward. There was time for postdoc staff to work on the project, a small amount of time for us PIs, and they paid the costs of us all getting together when we could do that in person. There was also quite a bit of in-kind contribution from NOAA staff who contributed their time to the project. Okay, so what were our goals? Bring together scientific leaders in density surface modeling, share information about best practices, develop and implement innovative approaches for advancing the methods to characterize marine species abundance, focusing on US Navy training and testing areas because of our funding. Provide user-friendly no-cost tools, implementing the new approaches so that everyone can use them. We were providing statistical support to those who do density surface model for Navy environmental impact assessments, so some consultancy effectively. Accessible guidance for practitioners in the form of public reports and publications, and I'll show you some of those a bit later. We wanted to also highlight, we knew we weren't going to solve all the problems, so highlight areas for continued research, and also solicit input from the wider scientific community, which is you guys, and share our findings through public workshops like the one that we're giving now. So in running the working group, we had annual working group meetings, and in between the meetings, we span out a bunch of technical groups. Our first meeting, we did a prioritization exercise to look at which topics were important, and then we span out technical groups dealing with each of those in turn effectively. There's an outreach component, so public meetings. There was one at the Halifax Marine Mammal meeting conference. There's one at Barcelona, and then this is our third and final one. And we have a website. I'll give the address again at the end. And there's also a FAQ, a knowledge base website that Jason Roberts will talk about a little bit later. We also produced a bunch of software tools with a focus on using R, the statistical software R. So this is a list of technical groups. There are 8 of them here, and these are the sort of years that we were working on them. And so what I'm going to do now is go through them all in turn and just tell you a little bit about each one. Some of them are the topic of later talks, so I won't talk about those very much at all, but just forward reference to the later talks. So let's start with the first one, extrapolation. What is extrapolation? I'm going to talk about this one a fair bit because it's really a topic of strong interest. It was talked about before at the 2019 Barcelona public workshop if you were there, so some of this is a repeat, but we've also done some more stuff since then. So So extrapolation is estimating the value of a variable in places where you haven't sampled it. So here, for example, are two covariates, 1 and 2, and you can see the dots are where the covariates were measured. And this is univariate extrapolation, for example, up here in the blue area. So I haven't measured covariate 2 as a larger value as where my cursor is here, although I have got lots of smaller values. There's also combinatorial extrapolation. So in this orange, yellow area here, it's within the range of covariate 2 and covariate 1, but I haven't got data points that are at both those at the same time, as opposed to inside this envelope here, which we call analog, which it's inside the range of both of my covariates. So there isn't any extrapolation there at all. What's the problem with extrapolation? Well, here's an example. So here is just one covariate, which is distance from shore, and maybe I've got lots of measurements out this far from shore and then none further out. Maybe I'm modeling beaked whales like this, for example. This is where I've got data, and this area here is where I haven't got data, but I need to make an estimate of density. I predict density with a smooth of distance to shore as my covariate, and where I stop having data, the smooth just projects forward from there in the same slope as it had at the point where we stopped having data. Now this is on the log scale, so if you back transform this by exponentiating, you end up with impossibly high density estimates, and that's the problem. And so not only can you get crazy estimates, but this model fit might be quite good where you have data, and so there's no diagnostic to tell you there that it's going to be gnarly. It's also sometimes a little hard. This is obvious and easy to tell that you're extrapolating. It can be hard when there's lots of covariates to tell that you're extrapolating, because this combinatorial thing can get quite hard when there are multiple covariates. What do you do? Well, the first thing is you avoid doing it in the first place, but sometimes we can't. The second is you mitigate. That's, for example, instead of extrapolating in a straight line like that, you might choose to just say, okay, there's reasonable estimates here, so I'm just going to assume that everything else beyond that is about the same. And the third is that we could look at some diagnostics of where we're extrapolating and then try and choose covariate combinations that minimize the amount of extrapolation that we're doing, among other things. And we spent quite a bit of time early in the project looking at diagnosis. So Phil Boucher was the person at St Andrews who led on that. We produced a technical report, a paper, and a software tool, Dsm Extra. What does that do? So the workflow here is that you have input data. This is sperm whales, for example. I think it's sperm whales in the Gulf of Mexico. No, yes, in the Gulf of Mexico. So the workflow is you sort of measure your covariates and look and get some diagnostics about how much extrapolation there is. You summarize them and maybe map them. And then once that helps you choose the covariates that might provide the least extrapolation, and then do your model fitting. And these are the kind of outputs that you get along the bottom here from the mapping. So green here is where there's no extrapolation from these data with, I think, 6 covariates. Orange is univariate extrapolation, and purple here is combinatorial. You can also get maps like this one in the middle that is a representation of how close you are to the data. So the bluer this gets, the further you are from that multivariate covariate cloud. And the third plot on the right here shows you which covariates are most responsible for the extrapolation. So green is no extrapolation, and then the other colors are color coded against the covariates. So you can see which covariates are causing the extrapolation. There are also tools in that package that let you look at different combinations of covariates that minimize extrapolation. So I encourage you to explore it. In terms of mitigation, we've developed much more recently, this is towards the end of the project now, some new models that are more conservative about their predictions. This is jointly with Simon Wood of the University of Edinburgh, and still under construction. That's what that icon means. So the idea here is when you have density surface models that have environmental covariates in them and spatial smoothers, what we do is we, for the spatial smoothers, we revert the smooth down towards 0. While keeping the environmental covariates. So the idea is that you may be extrapolating in space, but you're within your environmental envelope, so we're fairly confident about the environmental part of things, but we don't want the spatial smoother to just go crazy because you're extrapolating outside the spatial extent of your data. So here's an example. This is just a toy example. I'm afraid I've done a bad job here of representing the transects. They're just down there, so there's no transects elsewhere. And out here, we're predicting just a crazy number of sperm whales, more than 150 per 10 kilometers squared, which is obviously nonsense. This is using a sort of standard method. So with the new method, what happens is that spatial prediction goes down to 0, and so you don't end up with crazy predictions up in this area where you're extrapolating. But as importantly, if not more importantly, We're also saying that we really don't know what's out there. So the uncertainty goes up as you go away from your data in a way that standard methods don't do. So this is the coefficient of variation, and it's getting quite high as you go away from where you have data, which is, so we're saying we're getting a reasonable estimate, and we're saying we really don't know what's there as well. Okay, that was the first of the special topic, or the sort of threads that we technical groups that we went down. The second is model unification. So the problem here was that there are lots of different models with lots of jargon names, and their relative merits were unclear. So we've made a lot of progress on this, largely thanks to Dave. So a mathematical comparison of these different methods, of highlighting the common features among them, demonstrated that with different sort of software tools implementing different methods, apparently different, you can produce exactly the same results, again showing these links. We've come up with a new way of linking smooths across factor variables, and there's a paper on that, and also better approaches for quantifying uncertainty. So I just want to show sort of one slide on this competing software thing. So there's a paper here that shows that a stochastic partial differential equation approach called implemented through something called INLA, which is a technique but also a software package that's quite popular in R, is a flavor of a smoothing spline which are implemented in the Mgcv software in R through the models are usually called GAMs. And that demonstration is here. It's some real data, but it's through time. And this is the using the GAM software, but implementing the stochastic partial differential equation. This is the INLA version, and then this is a different type of smoother. And you can see that basically you're getting the same answer with all of them. So they really are the same kind of thing. So this really is nice because it bypasses these discussions about the pros and cons of the methods. The next thread was on uncertainty estimation. So the issue here is that there are lots of different sources of uncertainty, and it's not clear how to combine them together. As Jason said, that we start with modeling detectability, and then we model the spatial component of density, and they have different uncertainty coming in. And we'd like to propagate uncertainty from the detection modeling into the spatial model, and it's not particularly clear how to do that. So we've come up with some nice approaches there, and that's a talk that Dave's going to give right after this, so I won't say more. Another thread was on workflow. So this was Jason showed a relatively simple workflow before for going through these models. This is actually what his lab actually do in terms of all the data that goes in and all the different decisions they have to make. There wasn't, this is an internal thing that they have, so there wasn't tools and guidance externally available. So we had a lot of time discussing among the different groups what they do, and then synthesizing that down and trying to make the workflow clearer for people to follow if they want to. And Jason will be talking about that later. We weren't going to deal with pinnipeds in DenMod at all to start with, but in our first public talk, that was one of the discussion suggestions that came up, was that pinnipeds are important. And the data that you get for pinnipeds is rather different, as I said before, from the sort of line transect data that we're used to dealing with. So we undertook to do something about it, and luckily some working group members from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center had separate funding to use opportunistic sightings data to come up with density surface models. So the problem with opportunistic data is, for example, here you get a bunch of sightings, so these are just observations of northern fur seals, but you have no explicit effort, so you don't know where the survey effort was. So they used ship days, which is what's here, as an index of effort. It's very rough, so they modeled it to get a model for effort, and then we're able to put those together to get a model for fur seals. Now you don't have detectability, so you don't know that's a relative density surface, not an absolute one. So they corrected it with some pre-existing abundance estimates that were in a stratum, just in this stratum, to get an absolute density surface. And there's a paper on that, which is really nice work, combining different sources of information appropriately. Another thread was on bringing in acoustic data. So at our second working group meetings, basically at our second and fourth working, at our first, third and fifth working group meetings, we had public meetings, which some of you have been to. And at our second and fourth, we had an extra component where we brought in some other type of data. And at the second one, it was acoustic. So we had a special session on acoustic data. which are rather different from a visual data. So Jason described this kind of towed acoustic data, which can be treated like a line transect, but there are all these other kinds of acoustic data, for example, static bottom mounted, or bottom mounted but with data coming back, or floating acoustic data. And so there was some discussion, a lot of discussion to be had about how we integrate all these kinds of things together. And Tina Yak is going to be talking about this later. We'll talk about data integration. Another thread was on tool development, so this issue that we want to be able to produce tools that other people can use to not only to fit the models, but also to do model diagnostics and things like that. And we had a sort of prioritization exercise asking people what kind of tools they needed, and then developed tools to meet those needs. Jason will be talking about that later. At our fourth working group meeting, we covered unmanned aerial vehicles as our sort of new data type. So they tend to, there is a variety of these that are do have a human in them, in a pilot, but the key thing is that whether they have a human pilot or they're automatically piloted, they don't have any human observers. So they have cameras that either take photographs or videos. And so there's the question of how can you take these kinds of data and integrate them into produce density surface models. And again, Tina is going to be talking about that later. So that was a roller coaster tour of what we did in the DenMod project. As you heard, we'll be talking about some of those in more detail through the rest of the time, starting with Dave next talking about uncertainty. But here is our website, and you're welcome to go on there. So all of our papers are listed there, all of the software outputs as well, and a link to some of the other tools that we've produced. So you're welcome to go there and see what you think, and also please give us some feedback about things that work for you and don't work for you, and so on. Okay, I'll stop there for now. Over back to you, Katrina.
Thanks very much, Len. So as Len pointed out, uncertainty estimation and density surface modelling has been a key research area of the DenMod project. So I'm going to hand over to Dave Miller, also from the University of St Andrews, and he's going to provide an overview of our efforts on uncertainty estimation. So when you're ready, Dave, over to you.
Hi, folks. As Katrina says, I'm going to cover the uncertainty estimation part of the project. One of the big parts of that, the project was really trying to, sorry, excuse me for 1 second. Screen sharing wasn't on. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so one of the big parts of the project was investigating uncertainty, as Len has talked about already. So this really encompassed a lot of folks from different parts of the project. So we had folks here at CREAM, we had folks within MGL, within Duke, and then also NOAA collaborators too. Plus some people from outside of those groups who also contributed. There are lots of people, so thanks to all of them, I'll do that right off the bat. Okay, so I guess the first sort of important thing here is asking, like, why did we do this? So we know predictions are important, but we really can't say much about those predictions without uncertainty information, and that's really key to management decisions. So looking at this plot here, we have these hotspots in the just sort of off the sort of Boston kind of well, off the Cape Cod area. But like, is that good or is that bad? Is that a large number or not? We can't really say much about that without having some measure of uncertainty about how much we believe that quantity. So we really want to get this right in order to make good management decisions and have good interventions. So up until we started DenMod, we were really looking at a sort of fairly ad hoc way of addressing uncertainty within the kind of density surface modeling universe. So a lot of the time we would assume independence between model components, We might ignore some bits of uncertainty if it seemed too tricky, or we might engage in some kind of very complicated uncertainty measure. There were also different considerations for different species and ecosystems, so there wasn't a kind of unifying framework around what we were doing. And I think hopefully what I'm going to show here is we've taken a big step towards doing that. I don't think this solves every problem, but it certainly gets us toward that. So within DenMod, as Len said, we formed a series of working groups. So we had one on uncertainty estimation with contributions from both Duke and NOAA folks and people from outside. And sort of the big initial task was really looking at the various places that uncertainty can come from. So looking at those sources of uncertainty across the different components of the kinds of models that we fit. And then we tried really to find a framework that would pull as many of those in as possible. We haven't got everything in there, but we've tried to, pick some of the most common large sources of uncertainty, get that moving, and then we can see whether we can add on other stuff. And I'll talk about some of the things we didn't quite get to later on. Once we had all of that sort of sorted out, we've rolled it out into the modeling process within NOAA and Duke. So that's been really nice to go from thinking about things sort of loftily to actually getting stuff done. Okay, so first I'm going to kind of talk about where these sources of uncertainty are, and then I'm going to walk through how we combine them in our framework. So the first and maybe most obvious one is uncertainty in your spatial model can come from your spatial model. So as Jason and Len have said, the models that we're fitting are generalized additive models. So we end up with these kinds of effects where we have wiggly lines, and those gray bands represent the uncertainty around those from the model. So that's how uncertain the model is itself about each individual term. We need to take those bands and convert them into uncertainties about either abundance estimates, so a number, a standard deviation around the abundance, or to make these kind of CV maps or variance maps or standard deviation maps that Len was showing in his talk a few moments ago. Fortunately, there's lots of theory for this already. So this is pretty standard within generalized additive modeling and within generalized linear modeling. So we were able to just hijack those kind of techniques. So that's actually quite nice. The spatial model is really going to become the sort of central point of this. Actually, in some of the other talks, you'll see this as well. The spatial model is really kind of the glue that sticks everything together. And we use techniques from within the generalized additive modeling literature to kind of to get what we want out of it, and that's where all the action is happening. We plug other stuff into that. So a spatial model, we're all good. Then there's detectability. So when we include detection information in our density surface model, that enters into the model as an offset in it. And that means that if we make changes to that, it can actually have quite big effects on our outputs. So we should really be careful about quantifying uncertainty in that, because it could lead to potentially large changes in the uncertainty as well. Within the distance sampling literature, there's plenty of information on how to calculate uncertainty about detection functions and their corresponding probabilities of detection. That's fine. And again, the same thing happens if we go on to the sort of slightly more complicated case of dealing with trackline detectability, which Jason mentioned, this sort of G0 problem or perception bias problem, especially if those things are fitted in the sort of standard framework within mark recapture distance sampling, where it's all kind of one detection function anyway. So that stuff has its own kind of way of doing things, and we'll talk a little bit later on how to combine those. Our next sort of uncertainty, and I'll use some scare quotes there, is this sort of variation in environmental covariates. Here we see the sort of California current system, And we can see between two periods, we have quite different temperatures in the water, but we also have quite different temperatures over space as well. There can also be quite a lot of variability even on a smaller temporal scale. So we need to take into account that these changing conditions and how, if we make our prediction for the 1st of June, that might not actually be the uncertainty related to the 1st of June takes into account that those environmental covariates are fixed, doesn't take into account what might happen tomorrow. So we need to do something about how the environmental covariates will change over time within whatever period we're interested in making a prediction for. Then there are sort of some other bits here. So there is sort of concerns about things like availability. So how much time does the animal spend at the surface? Folks do observational and tag-based studies to get estimates of availability, and they'll have corresponding uncertainties attached to them. That kind of that's kind of fitting into what we're going to talk about next. The other three are a bit more complicated, and we haven't fully addressed here, and they're sort of a subject of future work, which Len will talk about later on. So those are species identification, both from the perspective of do we get species identification right? Like we could just get it wrong, so there is a possibility of that. And then secondarily, potentially easier case where we just have unidentified to a higher level, so unidentified large whale or unidentified dolphin or something like that. So that's kind of there's a whole world of uncertainty there to deal with. Then there's the sort of classic case of covariate measurement error. So for the remotely sensed covariates, so things like sea surface temperature, those come from models. Those models have uncertainties. There are ways of propagating that uncertainty through, so we should be aware of that as a problem. And then finally, and probably the most tricky of those, is group size error. So due to asynchronous surfacing behavior, we might end up with bad estimates of group size, so we should be mindful of that. Some recent work by Nat Kelly and co-authors has looked at that as well. So we've got all of these sources of uncertainty. What are we going to do? So I'm going to work through this by going through bit by bit and adding something each time. And again, well, as I said earlier, the spatial model really is the central part of this. So we'll go with that first. So we have our smooth, just working from left to right here. We have our smooth with its band of uncertainty. That's actually represented mathematically as a variance covariance matrix about the parameters beta and lambda. So there's a bunch of betas and a bunch of lambdas we have uncertainty about in our variance covariance matrix. One way we can get to uncertainty here is we can generate sample parameters using the distribution of the parameters that we got from fitting the model. So we'll generate a bunch of samples from the model that are possible parameters. Combining those with the environmental covariates and making predictions, we get these series of predictions. This is the three plots underneath each other. So we'll make a prediction for each sample, and that'll give us a different kind of universe, if you like, that the model thinks is possible. When we have this big set of possible universes, big set of possible predictions, we can make summaries over that to collapse it down into a single map. So for example, we could take the standard deviation per cell, per individual prediction cell in each of those, and that could give us a summary map like this. So we'll show a little bit later on other summaries that we can make that might also be interesting and useful. So that's the spatial model. So this is kind of the core thing of sampling from effectively the posterior distribution of the density surface model and asking it to give us predictions that are possible under the model. Now, The next thing we're going to add is the detection function uncertainty. So this is sort of ended up being a fairly major bit of work and a bit tricky, and certainly quite mathematically detailed. The why of this is a bit more simple though. So the spatial model deals with things in space. That's fine. The detection function is also a kind of implicitly spatial thing in itself. If we think about, if we go out in a boat and we record sea state, that sea state will change over space as well. So there's some kind of spatial sort of covariance between the spatial model and the detection function. And we need to account for that. We can't just add them up as if they're independent. We need to find out what their covariances are to make sure that we make good inferences. So myself, along with Mark Bravington and Sharon Headley, finally got this paper published last year on variance propagation. So the idea there is we'll take the uncertainty that we know about the detection function and we'll kind of glue it in to the variance covariance matrix for the spatial model. The way we do that is we add in a random effect that has variance that is derived from the detection function. And so we effectively just glue another component into that big variance covariance matrix. Then when we do our generating samples, making predictions, and then making the summaries, that detection function uncertainty is already kind of baked in to what's there. So that paper came out in the Journal of Agricultural, Biological and Environmental Statistics last year. There's lots of info in there about how to do this, also in particular situations that might be interesting, and a big simulation study that shows that we did roughly the right thing, and it doesn't do any worse than if you were trying to build some very complicated Bayesian model in JAGS or STAN or something like that. So that's the spatial model and the detection function combined into one, so that's good. Now let's add in environmental variability. So here we're just going to adapt what we've got so far and make it a bit more complicated. So we've already got our variance covariance matrix that has the uncertainty about the detection function and the spatial model. That's fine. We're again going to generate our samples. But instead of just taking one set of environmental covariates, we're going to take multiple sets for each, let's say, day, or any time period is fine. I'm just going to use day as shorthand here. And then we're going to make predictions for each of those days, and we're going to make as many predictions as we had samples. So then we're just going to have this huge set of predictions per day for different samples from the model posterior. So now we have this effectively all of those little pictures of off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. They each represent a different universe in which the model thinks something different and the environment was different. And we kind of have to pretend here that the environmental covariates that we chose those days are a good representation of the time period we're interested in making summaries for. But we always had to do that, so that's fine. Then when we've got all of these samples by day and by model posterior sample, we can make summaries over those again. So again, we could line up all of those cards on top of each other, and for each cell take a standard deviation or a mean or a median or whatever you want. But we can also make subsets of those and take summaries over those, which we can look at a little bit later on. So that was kind of the background of how all of that stuff works. I'll now show a kind of case study that we worked on that kind of prompted most of this work, actually. So this is a big data set from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center on fin whales in the California Current. The study went July through December in a bunch of years from 96 to 2014. There's actually a lot of data, and there's some interesting variations you can see in the sort of Bay Area. There's some finer lines, and then up right at the top, northern Washington, there's also a bunch of finer lines. So there were some differences in the sampling. Each of those black lines representing a transect there, and then the small dots are where fin whales were observed. So we went through and we tried to apply this framework to this data set. So we already had detection functions fitted in a paper by Jay Barlow, so we just pulled them out. Well, we emailed Jay and asked him for them. And so we used those sort of standard things you would have in detection function. So we have the vessel, which would take into account sort of height changes and things like that of the observers, visibility and sea state, accounting for weather conditions, and then also the school size. So that was the detection function model. We also had a G0 estimate, but it was actually a completely independent G0 estimate from a paper by Jay and Karen that we just included at the end. We didn't have a macro capture distance sampling estimate here, so that bit is a bit simpler for this data set, but in practice we can use those macro capture distance sampling detection functions as well if we needed to. We then built a spatial model using a GAM with smooths of space, sea surface temperature, the standard deviation of sea surface temperature, sea surface height, mixed layer depth, and year. As an aside here, another thing that we did during DenMod was a different kind of way of viewing this. So we're kind of used to looking at smooths in this way, where we look at the covariate on the x-axis and the effect on the y-axis, and that tells us a lot, and we can think about interpreting these in sort of ecological ways. But it's also interesting to look at these as a map, and so we can see here this is what each of those individual smooths look like spatially on the linear predictor scale, so on the log scale. And this can be kind of useful to see what the relative kind of influence of those different smooths can be on the model of those different covariates. So that's a function that's in the Dsm package that you can use, plot pred by term, I think it's called. So with those done, oh, sorry, before I go on, I should say all of this, all of the DSM modeling here was done by Elizabeth Becker. I can't claim any credit for that. So Elizabeth put all of this together, and then we went from there into getting the uncertainty as a group. So in terms of results, before I go to sort of the main bit, a thing that's kind of interesting, I was talking about sort of taking different summaries here. This isn't even really a summary. This is just within a given day. This is an animation just looking at the different samples from the model. So this is fixing day, but letting the sampling change over the spatial model detection function bit. So what we see is it's basically the same pattern, but we're changing the intensity in different parts, especially in the sort of the very southwest. There's this sort of flashy on and off sort of axe looking thing. So that can be kind of interesting to look at what's changing in different areas. We can do the same kind of thing and look at the between time period uncertainty. What we see here is actually huge differences in distribution in some places. There's a sort of a various flashes in the very south of strange things happening. This is just looking at just the environmental effects. So these are just the changes due to the environment fixing all of the model parameters. So I don't necessarily think these are things that we need to present every time, but it's kind of interesting to look at where the uncertainty comes from, and they also are kind of nice to look at. So we can squash all of that stuff down and get an overall standard error, like I was talking about before. So taking each cell, matching them in space, and then crushing it down over time to get the individual standard errors for each point in space. That's what's shown here. That seems like the kind of thing we'd want to have in a paper. With this data set, though, we have lots of years. So maybe we should sort of do a bit of slicing and dicing here. For a start, we can take summaries. We can ignore the spatial bit totally and make monthly summaries of abundance with uncertainty. So this can be really useful to just get that kind of time series out. So here we can see June through December for each of the years that the survey happened. We're not going to try and make abundance predictions outside of when we had a survey. We can also do that same thing, but in a spatial way. So these are the summaries per year. We could have done them per month, but there would have been too many and they'd be too small. So this is per year, what's the density, and then below that, the corresponding standard error. So this can be really, really useful too, especially when we have these larger temporal data sets. Then we can compare those to what exists in the literature, which can be useful too. So these were just abundance estimates from 2 previous papers. We see there's relatively good agreement. There's less good agreement further with the model that's given in green here, but that paper uses quite a different methodology, so we might expect to see a bit of a difference there. Okay. Okay, so this is me just wrapping up. So in summary, we can now slot in a bunch of different sources of uncertainty, put them in this big funnely thing, and then get out of it predictions that we can then take summaries over that give us a handle on the uncertainty in these models that have these multiple components and multiple sources of uncertainty. A thing that I really like about this is there's not a change in the modeling process. You still fit your DSM as normal, you still fit your detection functions as normal, and you still pretty much make your predictions as normal. There's just this extra machinery on the end. We're not asking folks to completely change how they do things, move to a different paradigm. We're still sticking within the way DSMs normally work. We're just doing a bit of post hoc stuff. And sort of really satisfyingly, this has all been applied within the Southwest Fishery Science Centre's process and is in some publications already. And Duke are in the process of putting this in. There are various bits that have already made it. I don't want to speak exactly to that with Duke people here. I'll let them say one thing or the other, and the same for Northeast as well, the Northeast Fishery Science Centre as well. So it's really nice to see that stuff rolled out. So in terms of using this stuff, there is a Southwest Fishery Science Centre tech report, and based off that, there's this paper in Frontiers in Marine Science that came out last month that applies the methods. And then we have a paper that really looks into the technical detail of this that's basically ready, and I just need to submit sometime soon, and that will have all of the R code with it that will allow folks to apply these however they like. And that is it from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dave. So we're now going to have a short comfort break. So please go and get yourself a fresh cup of tea, and we'll see you back at 12:15 Eastern time, daylight time. And please remember to put your questions in the chat function in the Q&A button at the top, so that we can have time to look at those over the next hour or so. Right, we'll see you back at 12:15. Thanks. Okay, welcome back everyone. So we're going to start this next session with a short presentation from Jason on workflow tools and applications. So I'll pass over to you, Jason.
Great, thanks. We shared the screen there. Okay, so I'm just going to give a very short presentation talking about practical tools that you can use in your own DSM workflows. So we're mainly going to talk about 2 things here quickly. Whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen. All right. Sorry, I have a little bar at the top of this screen. I hope this bar will go away. All right. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the core packages maintained by the DenMod team. And some of these existed in some form before DenMod was created, and they're definitely all going to continue to exist after DenMod is done. And let's talk about what they are. So the first one is the DSM package. So this is the main package that's used to fit and predict full density surface models. And the main thing that this does for you is this integrates the packages Mrds to fit detection functions and Mgcv to fit GAMs to automate the entire DSM workflow. And Dave Miller is the primary developer of this package. And over the years, we've submitted many kind of different requests to him to automate and create different things that we needed in our own workflow. So for example, when DenMod started, DSM only had the ability to utilize one detection function. And as you've seen from some of the studies that we have, we're integrating data from many different survey programs, many different platforms. And so we needed the ability to integrate multiple detection functions into a single density surface model. And then not only that, to propagate the uncertainty using the method that Dave, Mark Bravington, and Sharon Headley developed, to propagate that through to the spatial component of the model. And so Dave put in a lot of work to implement that into the DSM package. And so for people starting out with density surface modeling, this is what I would highly recommend, is to start with the DSM package, look at the vignettes and examples that are available, and it will probably give you just about everything you need. Going beyond that, you may have some kind of more advanced detection modeling scenarios. For example, you may need to fit models that involve two observer teams in an MRDS marker capture distance sampling model, and you may need to control the parameters for how that's being done very carefully. And so for that, you may need to use the MRDS package. Or if you're like us at Duke or the Northeast Fisheries Science Center or Southwest Fisheries Science Center, and you want to fit your own detection functions in your own customized DSM workflow, then you may want to use this directly rather than going through DSM. Finally, there's the DSM Extra Package, which Len brought up earlier. This is a new package that was introduced during the DenMod project to quantify and visualize extrapolation in spatial models. I just want to point out that this is something that you need to install from GitHub rather than the R-CRAN repository. And finally, there also is a package called Distance, and it would be well to not confuse this with the DSM package. This is a package that's used for estimating abundance with basic distance sampling in the kind of stratified way that Len talked about. But you usually don't need this package for density surface modeling. I want to point out that DenMod related package development will continue. And so one example of this is in the DSM packet, DSM Extra Package. There are functions in there for summarizing extrapolation, but not for summarizing extrapolation across a time series of rasters. That's something that we didn't have time to explore in the initial working group that developed this package. So the current package is best suited to static models or to like a single time slice of a dynamic model. And at Duke, after this, we developed a new function to calculate and summarize the statistics from that across a time series of covariate rasters. And this is something that was first applied by Anna Kenyatis in her models last year for the 6th Fleet, US Navy 6th Fleet study area in the Eastern Atlantic. And we plan to incorporate this into the DSM package later this year, or sorry, DSM Extra Package later this year. But you can contact us for code sooner, and there's the function signature for it. And so I just wanted to show a quick example of the output of that. We have very recently applied this to the AFTT Phase 4 density surface models for the US Navy that are now in the process of being delivered to the Navy for their next AFTT EIS. And so here's an example of those plots being produced for that region for Atlantic spotted dolphin in November. And so what's happened here is predictions from multiple years are summarized into single outputs. Second thing I want to briefly touch on is the density surface modeling FAQ, or frequently asked questions list. So this captures advice about problems that we frequently encountered or were frequently brought up to us by colleagues. And this is organized as a public citable wiki that allows revisions and additions, and we will hopefully continue to update this beyond the DenMod project. And I've provided a link here for it. Len actually provided the DOI link, which actually is probably better to use than this. But anyway, if we click on this, we can go to a quick live demo of what this looks like. So inside here, there are kind of 4 categories of questions. DSM workflows. Len talked about how we kind of explored different workflows that people use. We have some information in there about that. Surveys and survey data. This isn't really the focus of this, but we have some comments about surveys and survey data that can be helpful if you plan to do density surface modeling. And then we have 2 sections here on the detection models and spatial models. And this is really where a lot of the questions came up. So for example, if I click on detection functions, you know, here's a category, several categories of different questions that we had. So for example, on say detection function covariates, we can go in and see some common questions. What is the minimum number of sightings I need to fit a detection function with a covariate? What should I do if I have a categorical detection covariate that has a category with only a few sightings? So for example, here we barely have any sightings in Beaufort category 6 or Beaufort category 0. What can you do about that? And it goes through a long discussion of that. And should I transform detection function covariates? And the simple answer on that is generally no. Anyway, so we have a whole collection of questions there under each of these categories for detection models. And here under spatial models, we also have a whole collection here. And so I guess I'll click on one just to give an idea. So for example, you might be interested in Mgcv model selection questions. So how do I perform model selection with Mgcv? What smoothness selection method should I use? Should I limit the degrees of freedom for model terms by specifying, say, k = 4? This particular question is one that occupied us for quite some time. And you know, for some of these questions, there isn't a clear answer. It depends on what your objectives are, and that's one that is like that. How do I perform automatic term selection with Mgcv? Should I remove shrunk terms and refit the model? Should I remove terms not shrunk to 0 that have low estimated degrees of freedom, and so on? So we highly encourage you to go check this out. I will say there are, I think, 2 places still where we haven't finished the sections. One I will point out is this predictions summarizing. And this does not say anything right now. And the reason why is that Dave mentioned that we're writing a whole paper on this topic. And so the paper has actually been drafted, and hopefully we can submit that soon. We probably should take something in the intermediate time and put it in here that kind of represents a placeholder until the final paper comes out. So I'm going to skip this because we already talked about it. And then just to wrap this up really quickly, to summarize the key resources, check out these R packages, check out the FAQ, check out the DenMod website. As Len mentioned earlier, that has lists of additional resources, including a series of papers that were published from this project. And then a final thing that I would mention is if you have any questions, you can of course always contact us, but there is a very active email list that sees daily traffic, the distance sampling email list, and it doesn't concern questions just of distance sampling. There are frequently questions that come up about density surface modeling, which is really, you know, an extension of distance sampling. So that's free to access, and you can search the archives or ask new questions, and we encourage you to follow up there. So Katrina, that's all I have for this topic. Can I pass it back to you?
Thanks very much, Jason. So as Len mentioned, data integration across different survey methodologies has been an active area of research within the project. And so I'm going to hand over to Tina Yak from Duke University, and she's going to provide a summary of our efforts on this topic. So over to you, Tina. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So today, on behalf of the DenMod team, I am going to talk a bit about the work that we've done toward building density surface models using data integrated from multiple survey types, including line transect, acoustic, and unmanned aerial vehicle or UAV surveys. So let's start off by asking first why we need data integration in density surface models. Oftentimes we are trying to model abundance over large spatial areas, which may not have any traditional visual survey effort in offshore areas, or perhaps during certain seasons like winter, which are difficult to survey visually given weather conditions oftentimes. So I'll present here an example of how data integration has helped to improve density surface models. So here on the right, we can see an example of the effort and sightings from winter that were used by the Duke team to model sperm whale abundance on the US East Coast in AFT Team Phase 3 models for the Navy. And here the red box outlines an area of important sperm whale habitat for which we have essentially no survey data. So we tested Phase 3 models using covariates that were taken from the month and the year that the data were collected. This is the black line here in the graph, and then also using covariates from long-term climatological averages, and this is the red line in the graph. And is illustrated in this graph, which is showing us predicted abundance on the y-axis and then month along the x, we can see that both model types showed a summer peak and a winter low in mean abundances predicted for all years. However, there was some recent work by Joy Stanistreet and colleagues that showed that sperm whales were present at seemingly high levels in fall and winter at multiple locations along the East Coast using data from fixed acoustic recorders. And so here we can see that at Cape Hatteras, for example, peak acoustic presence is in fact occurring during winter. This would suggest that the effort bias in the models, essentially not having any winter data, is resulting in a seasonal bias in the predictions. That's an artifact of this and not representative of any real seasonal variation. So fortunately, in 2019, a brave team from Song of the Whale went out to conduct winter and spring surveys off of Cape Hatteras. And given the weather challenges, we knew that this would need to rely on acoustics for cryptic species like beaked and sperm whales especially. The map on the right shows in red the line transects that were completed during the survey and the corresponding 239 acoustic sperm whale detections, which are indicated here by the red circles. So the survey contributed greatly to our knowledge of the species in seasons where we previously had almost no data. But in order to build better density surface models, we needed to be able to use this acoustic data. And luckily, the DenMod group had laid a strong foundation for this. So to get the data we needed after the map survey, recordings that were made in the field were then examined in PamGuard software. The click trains produced by sperm whales during their foraging dives were then marked out as events. Those are shown here in this time bearing display in the top left panel. That gives time along the x-axis, bearing along the y, and then the sperm whale click trains are marked out in the various colors over a 6-hour period. And then below this, I'm just showing examples of the waveform spectrum and Wigner plot of an individual click, and then a spectrogram of a sperm whale click train. So once individual click trains were identified, estimates of slant ranges from the track line were made using target motion analysis. And I'm just showing an example of this here on the right, where bearing convergence is shown here as the yellow stars indicate the animal's estimated position. And so from all of this data, we generated an independent acoustic detection function for sperm whales that's shown here on the left. Additionally, sperm whale availability bias estimates were calculated by the MAPS team, and they used Monte Carlo simulation methods to simulate dive profiles from DTAG data that was actually collected during the survey. And so incorporating this acoustic survey into the model allowed us to produce what we think are more representative models for sperm whales in this year's AFTT Phase 4 modeling effort. And the mean abundance predictions are shown here on the map on the left. And then on the right, we see the monthly predictions with month along the X and predicted abundance on the Y again, which if we compare that to the previous model, shows us less variability monthly overall and higher winter and spring abundances than were previously predicted. We still have this peak in summer, but the seasonal disparity is much more evenly distributed. So ideally, these acoustic surveys along the East Coast will continue in future so that we can also capture any interannual variability that might be occurring in our future models. So here I'll just play a monthly animation that shows the CVs on the left and abundance predictions on the right, so that we can visualize the changing monthly distribution of sperm whales that were predicted by the new model. And you can see that abundance increases as we're moving here into summer and early fall. At the same time, distribution seems to shift northward up into the Gulf of Maine in the spring. And if we look down at Cape Hatteras, we can see lower summer abundance that increases in fall and winter. So all of this corresponds more closely to the fixed acoustics information than the previous models. So I think all in all, this example shows us pretty clearly why data integration methods are important for improving density surface models. And I'll just note here that the MAPS acoustic survey also provided us with the opportunity to produce updated density surface models for both Cuvier's and Mesoplodont beaked whales during this year's modeling efforts. And I'm just showing you their mean density here in the maps. Okay, so now that we can see why and how acoustic data, or data integration in general, I guess, acoustics specifically, can improve density surface models, let's take a step back and then look more closely at the methods and some examples from other DenMod case studies. So as we've pointed out, traditionally, data for building density surface models comes from visual-based or aerial surveys. But again, there's great interest and need, as we have just witnessed, in combining these data with other survey techniques, particularly towed array acoustics and UAV data. So when integrating different data types, there are some technical considerations, which we alluded to but glossed over in the example that I just showed. So first we have different effort and different detection types, be those acoustic encounters or photographs to consider in our analysis. Next, we'll have to consider that each survey will also have unique probabilities of detection or detection functions associated with them. And additionally, each survey type will have different bias corrections that also will need to be incorporated into the model. So considering that workflow that Jason presented earlier, how do we get from distant sampling inputs to creating density surface models integrating these different data types? Well, given the multiple data inputs, we'll need to create segments for each data set. And then again, separate detection functions will be modeled and separate bias corrections will be included. And then we can use all of this information to calculate an effective surveyed area and account per segment, which are then all going to be included in a spatial model along with any environmental covariates that we choose. So here the spatial model really acts as the glue that sticks together the two different survey types, or however many different survey types we might include. And then that effective area surveyed is acting as a correction to both methods in order to put them more on equal footing when it comes to modeling. And that becomes really important because since we're including data from multiple sources, they're going to be in different locations, we really need to ensure that all biases are addressed. Otherwise, we'll end up with spatial biases in our final spatial models, as we saw in that earlier sperm whale example. So again, the spatial model assumes it's dealing with the same data when fitting the model, and we're going to address this by dealing with all the various biases in stage 1 of our modeling process. So let's just look at an example here to be considered with acoustic data and illustrate the importance of data preparation, bearing in mind, as Dave notes, data prep is hard. And as we all know, beaked whales and sperm whales are deep diving species. They're vocally active and available for acoustic detection during large portions of those foraging dives, as illustrated here in this figure. However, that acoustic behavior also presents a problem when using conventional distance sampling methods and localizing with a linear towed array. And so that problem is that using a 2D array, we can't estimate the depth of the animal unless we're able to calculate this from, say, surface reflections of clicks. But in most cases, what we're actually obtaining here is a slant range, and rather than a horizontal or perpendicular distance that we require for conventional distance sampling. And so this is a problem for any species that can dive nearly as deep as their detection range. And we know that ignoring this problem is going to overestimate perpendicular distances, and this overestimation will be most severe close to the track line. The overestimate of distance then inflates our probability of detection, and then consequently that results in an underestimate of density. And so to address this problem, we can incorporate a depth distribution into the algorithm that estimates the probability of detection. Specifically, information about the depth distribution of the study species is then incorporated into the maximum likelihood estimator of the detection function parameters. The algorithm then works using the slant ranges to the animals. Now here, we're still assuming that the horizontal distribution of animals from the transect is uniform, but we know that the depth distribution is not, as different species will have different depth preferences, and so using this method, we can incorporate all of that information and use it in our detection function. And so the depth distribution model was first described by Danielle Harris, and we'll have a paper coming out soon describing these methods in more detail. So additionally, Danielle and I worked on a project that we presented at a DCLD conference way back in 2015 to compare this method to traditional distance sampling methods for Cuvier's beaked whales in the Gulf of Alaska. And we wanted to assess the bias that was associated with not incorporating a depth distribution into the detection function. The results shown here with 121 animals estimated using conventional methods and 145 animals using the depth distribution methods for 2 of our surveyed strata indicate about a 20% underestimate in abundance would occur if slant ranges are left uncorrected. So that can be really important when you're trying to get as accurate of a results as we want for the density surface models. And so what we did was to take these methods and improve upon and incorporate these into the Dsm package in order to work with Northeast Fisheries Science Center sperm whale visual and acoustic data. These were from AMAP's 2013 and 2016 surveys. And those transect lines and the associated sperm whale encounters are shown here on the map. Below this, you can see the original slant ranges on the left, illustrating that if we left this uncorrected, that dip in detections near the track line would most definitely result in an underestimate in density. And then on the right, the depth distribution of sperm whale dives that was described by Watwood et al. In 2006 is shown. And we use this information to inform our depth distribution model and essentially correct those slant range data, collapsing it back to that semicircle we showed in the previous slides in order to get a detection probability that we could then use in our acoustic models. So ultimately, we ended up using this data in a case study to model the visual and acoustic simultaneous surveys both separately and then produce this combined model over on the right. And so if we look at these results, we can see that the distributions predicted, perhaps not surprisingly, by the visual and acoustic surveys independently are actually quite different in different locations. But then in the combined model, we're able to capture both of those distributions quite well. And so I'll just note here that we'll have a vignette coming out soon for this case study, and also say a big thanks to our NOAA colleagues for providing us with these data. So ultimately, there are several benefits to using acoustic data. We can collect better data on cryptic species, as we have just seen. We can collect data in inclement weather, as well as overnight. If we're talking about fixed recorders, we have better temporal coverage and longer-term monitoring opportunities in more remote areas with less inherent risk to humans. Acoustics can also be more cost-effective than visual methods. And so moving on here, another candidate for data integration in density surface models is from UAVs. And just a quick Google search can show us that the increasing prominence of UAVs in marine mammal research, as well as their various utilities in both research and conservation efforts. So here we present a case study to show how UAV data can be integrated into density surface models. And this is joint work by Dave and Nat, Chris, and Amanda, our Australian collaborators, using some UAV and aerial survey data of dugongs in Shark Bay, Western Australia. And so the occupied and UAV survey data are both shown here, with the occupied aerial survey sightings on the top panel and the UAV survey sightings on the bottom. Now, to produce this data from the UAV methods, there first needed to be methods developed to automate the image processing and derive a detection function, which was a lot of hard work that was completed by Amanda, Chris, and Nat and their colleagues. And so we're just glossing over that here, but I really want to point out again that as with the acoustic data, data prep is really a key and critical component in all of this. Okay, so once all of the data was prepped for both surveys, we took availability bias estimates from a Pollock et al. 2006 study, where a fake manatee was cleverly used to conduct experiments in order to determine zones of detectability for dugongs at a range of depths, turbidities, and sea states. So both of these surveys also used Huggins mark recapture methods in order to get to the probability of detection. So having this case study actually resulted in developing a new detection function option in the R package DSM in order to be able to use these R-mark models. So that's a nice functionality we have now. And then using these data, we then built independent models for each survey and a joint model using the DSM package, which as a result of DenMod methods as well, now allows for multiple detection functions to be bundled into a single density surface model using this multi-DDF function. So if we look at those results, we can see that the distributions that were predicted by these simultaneous visual and UAV surveys shown in the plots on the left independently were quite similar. And then in the combined model, we're again capturing the overall distribution quite well. However, the UAV survey predicts higher abundances in all areas, and this difference can become quite clear if we plot it out, showing the differences in abundance prediction scaled from blue to red here. So it looks like in this case study, the UAV survey, given its rather perfect detection from photographs, seems to be able to provide more improved abundance estimates, at least in this case study. Some other benefits of UAV data integration include, again, less inherent human risk. They also have more maneuverability than ships, less intrusive to marine life. We have accurate data logging from photos that provide us with the opportunity for precise and repeatable measurements. And we have also just illustrated in our case study that these, can be more effective or perhaps more accurate overall. And again, they can be more cost effective than full-scale aerial surveys. So to conclude here, we'll have some vignettes coming out soon for the acoustic and UAV data integration case studies. And then, as I pointed out, the ability to integrate multiple platform detection functions is also now available in the DSM package, and the depth distribution model functionality will soon be added. So having demonstrated that we can successfully combine multiple survey types into single spatial models, we believe these methods can, with more methodological development, perhaps in a future DenMod, be extended to include combined fixed acoustics and line transect surveys into density surface models. We also think that future potential sources of data integration could include other survey types, as Len mentioned earlier, like opportunistic, satellite, and tag data. But again, more methodological development are needed for those applications. And so with that, I'll just say thank you to LMR, to the DenMod Working Group, and all of our collaborators, and all of you, of course, for attending today.
Thank you very much, Tina. That was great. So, as I'm sure has become very obvious over the last couple of hours, DenMod's been a collaborative effort with partners, many partners from across NOAA. So now we would like to invite Karen Forney from Southwest Fisheries Science Centre and Doug Skirney from the Northeast Fisheries Science Centre to give their perspectives on the projects and the outputs from the NOAA side of things. So we'll start with Karen. I'll hand over to you, Karen, for the next few minutes, and then we'll switch to Doug. Over to you.
Okay, sorry for those technical glitches. It's always something. Thank you for sharing the slides. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I only see part of my slides here, but oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so sorry about the glitches. I just want to give a quick overview of our West Coast or Pacific NOAA perspectives on some of the DenMod process. From my own personal experience, I just want to say it's been absolutely fabulous working with such an amazing, competent and brilliant team, and we've really developed a lot of great tools. And I'd like to focus on just a few examples. And in particular, they relate to the uncertainty estimation, which has been a question that we've wrestled with for quite some time in the Pacific. And I'm presenting on behalf of Elizabeth Becker, who has done most of the work on this. She's been the lead PI on this, and the rest of the Southwest team, Southwest Fisheries Science Center and Pacific Island Center teams. So as I mentioned, the methods that DenMod has developed have really been very critical for improving our variance estimations to better account for a greater number of known sources of uncertainty. As part of this process to develop the new methods, we've also increased the consistency between the Pacific and the Atlantic Gulf of Mexico regions, which Jason and Elizabeth always are happy about when we can come up with consistency despite our different survey methodologies in many cases. And as a result, NOAA, US Navy, and BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, have definitely been able to, we've been able to produce more advanced products to support all of the various management goals. Lastly, which has been kind of a fun iterative process, we've, through applying the new methods in a number of papers and reports that are shown here on the right, we've been able to test and basically break and then refine the methods sort of as we go, and have resulted in 3 publications that I just want to briefly go over. And they include just examples from the US West Coast, from Hawaii, and from the Southern California current region. If I could go to the next slide, please. So the first example is our longstanding study area along the US West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, the California current ecosystem. And we've in the past done very systematic, comprehensive design-based surveys and been able to estimate abundance that way. But in 2018, our survey covered was much more heterogeneous because we had to combine it with fish surveys. And the resulting spatial density estimates from the species distribution models, for the first time, we're able to include these greater sources of uncertainty, including not just the detection probability uncertainties, but also the model parameter uncertainties in a comprehensive way. And Dave and Jason already talked a little bit about this, but the fin whale example is shown here with, on the left, a density surface along with the white sighting dots, and on the right, coefficients of variation. This was the first time that we had included all of these various sources of uncertainty in our density model-based abundance estimates, and so we were very excited to have these and be able to incorporate them into our 2021 stock assessment reports for 10 different species. Next slide, please. A second example is for the Hawaiian Islands exclusive economic zone. The Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center folks, Aaron Olson and Amanda Bradford and colleagues, had done surveys during winter in addition to the summer surveys. And on the left, you'll see the summer surveys in the entire EZ are shown in orange, and there were some more nearshore winter surveys. And what we did was look to examine whether we could identify seasonality in the distribution and abundance of species within this region. And it was a fairly complex undertaking with all the different species, but the short story is on the left side, we see in the lower bottom, I just wanted to note that we were able to develop a year-round model for humpback whales that captured their seasonal migration on a fairly fine scale grid, 9 by 9 kilometers. That was more fine than what we had done before. And for the other species, there was no evidence of seasonality, and so we updated our models using these new methodologies to get abundance estimates and, again, greater uncertainties, greater level of uncertainty included in the estimation, and these will be incorporated also in the 2022 stock assessment reports. Next slide. This will be my final slide. And I'll just move on. I don't know. There we go. And the last example is a new region for us. It was what we call the Southern California Current region, which includes the Southern California Bight region, as well as waters off Baja California, Mexico. And we had never been able to estimate abundance in this region in this way because, as you can see on the left, the transect lines were rather heterogeneous, definitely not design-based. And using the new methodologies, we were able to develop models for this region, which is of particular importance for the US Navy, given that they have a testing range that extends throughout a lot of this area. And so again, we were able to apply the new methodologies, including uncertainty estimation from all of these parameter uncertainties into our models. And this was published in that last paper in Frontiers in Marine Science. So overall, we've been really excited to be able to incorporate all of these changes and foster this collaboration with Duke and St. Andrews and all of our East Coast collaborators as well. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to pass over to Doug Sigourney from the Northeast Fisheries Science Centre to hear their contributions on their perspectives rather on the DenMod project and the contributions to the Fisheries Science Centre there. Over to you, Doug.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for this opportunity once again to present. DenMod, I just would like to say that DenMod has been a really incredible opportunity to get together over multiple meetings and multiple days and to hear from all the experts and be able to sort of take on these challenges with modeling. It's really been quite an exciting time, and it's pretty grateful to be a part of it. A couple of specific products that have come out that have helped us at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. One is with the density surface modeling, which we've heard a lot about, and in particular the DSM package. At the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, we use 2 independent teams or double observer data for both our shipboard and aerial platforms. And we've experimented with 2 ways of analyzing these data. One is the sort of traditional-ish standard 2-step process that Jason had talked a little bit about, where you correct for your perception bias in the first step, and then you apply the density surface model in the second step. And the advantages there is this is pretty well vetted now process, and it's fairly quick, but with uncertainty being a big issue, you're failing to propagate some of the uncertainty in that first step to the second step. So this has been one of the many challenges of density surface modeling. How do we do that? So we explored the Bayesian hierarchical method, which is sometimes called the one-step method, because you're jointly estimating everything together, and it has that advantage of propagating all the certainty from all the different components into the end product. But it is can be very time consuming, almost prohibitively time consuming in some instances, depending on how much data you have. So we've been very interested in this Dsm package, but initially that was only for single observer data. So with DenMod and working with some of the folks at DenMod, we expressed our needs for something like that could deal with our 2 double observer data, and we worked on updating the package, which led to this collaboration. We compared it to the Bayesian model for some fin whale data, and they match up really well. So we're really excited about this step, and we're in the process of starting to apply this more broadly to our larger data set. So we also heard a lot about acoustics. This has been a big issue for us at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. We have a big and impressive growing database of acoustic data. We also specifically collect some of that data simultaneously with our shipboard survey. So we tow a hydrophone behind the ship as the visual observers are observing at the same time. So this is a really great opportunity to be able sort of to observe both environments. But it comes with the challenge of trying to develop tools statistical tools to model these data. So, and this has been another hot topic with the DenMod group, and we've discussed this quite a bit, and it's led to some ongoing collaborations, which Tina had talked a little bit about. One in particular is this example here with the sperm whales of trying to, DenMod helped us create some code to add the acoustic and the visual patterns together. So that was very nice. We're also continuing to work with DenMod in terms of updating sort of density surface or distance sampling techniques for specifically for analyzing acoustic data. So this is again ongoing, but very exciting and very helpful to what we're trying to accomplish at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Another great tool that has come out of the DenMod group is this tool for diagnosing extrapolations. We have a collection of 24 environmental covariates, and it's continuing to grow. So it's great to have all these different covariates that you can look at, but it opens up the door for heavy extrapolation if you're not careful. And this has been a particular issue with the Bayesian model, where it really blows up, where it really skews whether it's an abundance estimate or some of the density estimates are really skew way out into sort of nonsensical land. And so having this tool that can automatically diagnose those extrapolations for you has been very helpful. And we've just started to implement this with some of the Bayesian analyses that are ongoing, and it's been extremely helpful in diagnosing where those extrapolations are and then being able to correct for them. And then finally, just the general support that we've gotten over the years being part of this group. A couple of specific products that we got a lot of feedback with was when we were developing our Bayesian hierarchical model for analyzing density surface models. We got tons of feedback, tons of opportunity to be able to present and hear back from the group, including a very thorough review during the peer review process from a DenMod member that was very helpful. So we're very grateful for that. And another big technical project that we got quite a bit of feedback from, very helpful feedback, was we've been working on our own method for integrating acoustic data with the visual line transect data when they're collected together. And there's many challenges, some unforeseen, and it was extremely helpful. All the feedback we've gotten, and this paper is now in review, so I'm very excited about that. So a big thank you to DenMod, and as I said, we're very grateful. It was a tremendous opportunity. And I'd also just say, from my own personal perspective as a data analyst, I don't get the opportunity all that much to integrate or to meet directly with people in the management field. So having this opportunity to hear directly from the Navy and what they need and how they plan on using using our products, it's really been insightful, and again, a great opportunity for me personally. So I really appreciate that. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you, Doug. And I'm sorry we lost you right there, but we've got you back. I think in the interest of time, and because we've now got quite a few questions come into the chat that we'd like to try and address in the last 20 minutes of the call, I'm going to pass over to Len to just wrap up things to talk about future research directions for density surface modelling.
I feel like you've been shortchanged. I'd rather hear Doug than me, but there we go. All right, folks. So yes, I'm going to talk about future stuff. So if you remember, one of our goals was to think about, what other research could be undertaken, things that we didn't get to during the DenMod project itself. So I want to give you sort of some thoughts about that. These thoughts were developed as part of a working group meeting, so they're not just mine, they're everybody in the groups, and I'm going to just focus on 4 main topics. There are a few other things that we've thought of as well, and we've assembled a document on this that we have internally, so if people are interested in that, then please just contact us. So I'll go through data integration, species identification, temporal modeling, and some practical issues that we think could do with some more work. Okay, so data integration, I think there are 3 things here. So the first is that we haven't touched telemetry data at all, but it's clear that the more time animals spend in an area, overall, the higher the density in that area is going to be. And so there's clearly a link between telemetry data and transect-based data. Telemetry data could certainly be used to fill in the gaps of places where we don't have good transect data. The second thread here is to think about even further other data sources. So Tina explained some of our thoughts on integration of multiple data sources, but there are opportunistic sightings, the pinniped people used, but there's lots of other types of opportunistic data there, platforms of opportunity and so on. And I think we'll come back to that. Probably there's been a question on it, so we'll come back to that in the Q&A at the end. Strandings data may, with a lot of assumptions, tell you something about density. Photo ID, so capture recapture, you can do spatial capture recapture and get density surfaces. Genetic ID would be close kin capture recapture, and then possibly other aerial imagery, so whales from space type things are becoming a topic that people discuss. And then the third is maybe we could borrow strength by taking the habitat relationships that we learn in one area. This is from a paper by Laura Manocci at the bottom here, for example, near where I live, and applying those or jointly modeling those together with the same species on the other side of the Atlantic. And so there might be some sort of hierarchical work we could do combining across different survey areas. You could also think about possibly borrowing strength between species as well, potentially, although clearly there are quite strong assumptions there, and borrowing strength across time as well, which I'll come to in just a second. The second thread is species identification uncertainty. So as Dave was saying earlier, you know, the standard methods assume that we know exactly which species we've seen and we analyze those, but a few things happen. One is that we may write down the wrong species, and then secondly, there are cases where we don't know what species it is. We just know perhaps at some higher taxonomic level what it is. And at the moment, those are dealt with in a very non-integrated way. So we ignore misclassification completely, and for partial observations, we fit models, for example, density surface models by species A, by species B, and we fit a density surface model for the unknown ones, and then we prorate. And doing a more joined up way of fitting those would firstly probably give us a lot more power, but also would allow us to appropriately deal with the uncertainty. So there's definitely benefits there. And the second is that in general, a lot of these large surveys that we're used to using for density surface models are transitioning from dedicated survey vessels that can go into what they call closing mode, in other words, break off the transect and go and see what species they've just seen, to passing mode, where they have to continue steaming on because the ship is on another mission. And so the species uncertainty is going to become more of an issue in future, and so deserves special attention at this stage. The third topic out of the four is temporal modeling. So we have focused on density surface modeling in space largely. So space has been our mission, as it were. But a lot of people are interested in trends over time. We have sort of dipped our toe into thinking about, and especially at Duke, they think about this a lot, whether you should use, when you've got temporally varying covariates, should you use the actual covariate itself, so sea surface temperature, which varies over time, or something static and possibly some explicitly time variable, such as day of year or month or whatever, or maybe an interaction between those. A third possibility is an interaction between space and time. So you can allow the spatial surface to vary gradually over time, which is what's shown at the top here. So that's one kind of thread of things that I think needs some more research. The second is, if we're going to allow things to vary through time, as we can see on this top example, what you tend to get if you just have smooths involved is that you can get implausible jumps. And so in this particular case, the population is going way too high here. It's not really plausible that the population could increase by that much, given what we know about the biology of the animals. And so embedding a population dynamics model, or at least a very simple version of it, which is what's shown here, this is just a very simple carrying capacity model, can constrain the increase to be something a lot more biologically realistic, which is what's shown on the bottom here. And you can do that in a spatial way. So it's really linking in population dynamics, simple population dynamics model into density surface models. And the third is sort of linking with the top theme. There is questions to be asked about what temporal resolution of time varying covariates you use. Would you use them at the daily level or the weekly level, etc., which relates to what sort of temporal level the animals respond to the covariates at. So there's some thinking to be done there. And lastly, we have a grab bag of practical issues. I'm just going to highlight two of them. So the first is what's shown here, which is a case where we have we tend to make our predictions and build our models at the level that we have the covariates at, and these can be very large scale. So this is the entire west coast of the United States. But then if we want to predict down to some smaller level, the predictions start looking very, very blocky at that level. And so maybe there's some way that we can do some downscaling or some smoothing or something to try and get better predictions at these more local levels from these large scale models. And the second, which is a completely separate issue, is that we didn't deal at all with this issue where group size of schools is extremely variable, like with oceanic dolphins, where you sometimes see 1s and 2s of them and occasionally see enormous schools. And then building a spatial smooth based around such variable data is really tricky. So something that needs some more work. Okay, well, that's a sort of roller coaster view of some thoughts that we've got about future research. One thing that we've learned is that it's really good doing these things in a team and doing them in a team of users and statisticians kind of blended together. It tends to produce research advances that are usable or useful, but also encouragement for tools and software implementation that makes it useful to ordinary people, and also makes us give clear guidance about how to use things. The other thing that we found very useful is getting feedback from the community about the directions that we've been taking in order to prioritize what we do. And so that's why we wanted to leave some time at the end of this for getting your thoughts and input. And if you want to also email us some thoughts or suggestions for things that you find problematic that you think could do with future research in the future, then please do it that way as well. Okay, that's me for now. Back to you, Katrina.
Thank you very much, Len. Okay, so we're going to have a quick comfort break again. Let us have a chance to read all your questions and be ready to answer as many as we can in the last 15 minutes. So I'm going to suggest we break and we return at 13:15. So 15 minutes past whatever hour you are on in the world. So we'll see you in a few minutes. So welcome back, everyone. We're into the last 15 minutes of this webinar, and now is the chance for us to try and answer some of the questions that have come in through the chat. So thank you very much for all who have posted some questions. First of all, we have had a couple of questions about the availability of a recording of this webinar and the presentations afterwards. The webinar is being recorded and we will make it available afterwards. So after this event, maybe next week sometime, I will email you all with details of where you can obtain the recording. And also we'll try to make some versions of the presentations available on our DenMod website. So I will provide all that information in a follow-up email next week. Okay, so Rob, Schick and I are going to run the Q&A session. I will ask, we'll run through as many questions as we can in the next 14 or 15 minutes. So, okay. The first question, and I'm going to pose this to Dave. Dave and Len are now together, so we'll just ask the questions of Len, and one or the other of them will answer. So, does the process of calculating these uncertainties with multiple values for each covariates for each day, for example, require substantially higher computational power? Over to you, Len. Dave.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. So these things don't tend to be require too much computational power in more than you would need for predicting over the grid that you have. So the size of the prediction grid that you had, but you're going to have to make lots of predictions for all of these different time periods and different samples from the posterior. So what we actually found is this actually took up quite a lot of space recording all of this stuff, and so there was it wasn't so much a computational power issue as a storage issue on the other end. So just have a big old hard drive ready to put all of those samples on, and then you can process them afterwards. But it's not a big computational issue.
Okay, thanks, Dave. The next question is going to be for Len, so staying in the same room. If I have seasonal line transect data, but a pooled detection function because the sample size per season is not sufficient, is it still possible to fit a DSM model? Can I get seasonal specific abundance estimates with pooled detection functions?
Okay, that's another very good question. So yes is the first answer. Yes, you can do it.
but you need to be careful, because if you have a pooled detection function, you're assuming that the detectability is the same in both seasons. And if you imagine that detectability, let's say, is higher in the summer than the winter, then if you have a pooled detection function, that's going to bias the density high in the summer and low in the winter, right? And so really you need to be careful, and you should put covariates into your detection function model, both temporal and spatial, if you're going to make temporal and spatial predictions. If you don't have enough data to do that, you really should think about whether you should be doing density surface modeling, or, you know, are you happy with that assumption that detectability is the same across the things you want to predict?
Okay, so I'm going to ask another question of Dave. Dave, can we see an example of how the data input in distance for DSM?
Yeah, that's very easy to address. We'll post a link in the chat there to an example site that we have on the distance sampling website. So if you go to distancesampling.org, there's a subpart of that site called examples.distancesampling.org, and that has a bunch of different vignettes. So our code annotated that will show you how to do these various different kinds of analyses. That includes setting up your basic density surface model, as well as an example of how to do the kind of pre-processing that you need to do to the spatial data in order to get it in a format that you need to be able to start that analysis. There are also a bunch of other analyses there of how to get to grips with distance sampling in general as well there too. So I recommend you check it out.
Thanks, Dave. Back to Len. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, visualization. It is great seeing the uncertainty along with the density surfaces. However, will folks like regulators understand them or still focus only on the densities? For example, I believe I noticed a big cell of high uncertainty in Dave's presentation with the density rather low.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can't speak for the regulator, so, you know, I don't know. In fact, there probably are some in the room listening, and if they could speak, we would let them say. But I guess what I can say is give some thoughts about presenting uncertainty. And one is, I mean, who doesn't love those movies that Dave showed? So that's a nice way of demonstrating the uncertainty. But really, the way to present the uncertainty depends a lot on the question that's being addressed. So, for example, if your question is about what's the environmental impact, in other words, how many animals could be in the area because they could be stressed by some stressor, then you might want to consider presenting an upper quantile of the density surface and using that, so a 60th or a 70th under the sort of precautionary principle rather than the mean, because that way you're going to, if anything, overestimate the number of animals that will be there, rather than running the risk of underestimating. Another sort of example, I guess, would be if you're interested in using your environmental regulation position in order to mandate further work, then you would target the areas that have the highest uncertainty and say, okay, we need more survey effort in these areas. So you might be looking at coefficient of variation or something like that. The other thing to say is that there are lots of ways of calculating uncertainty, and so you've seen a few of them presented. So one of them was coefficient of variation, which is the standard error divided by the mean. But the problem with that is that when the mean is very low, then you're dividing by a very small number, and so the coefficient of variation gets very high. But if you actually look at the confidence, so these are in areas where the density is predicted to be very low, the coefficient of variation is very high, and so if you look at the confidence interval on what's there, the upper limit of that confidence interval is still very low. So you're confident there are a few animals there, it's just the CV is high. And so if you paid lots of attention to Tina's talk, for example, you'll have seen that she presented standard errors rather than the coefficient of variation, which give a more realistic view of what the absolute uncertainty is rather than the relative uncertainty. So there's a lot of things to talk about and think about how you want to present the uncertainty and what it is you're going to use it for. And then the last thing to say is, which components of uncertainty are you interested in? So are you predicting density trying to predict density for a particular year in the future, let's say, because you're worried about, let's say, I don't know, a wind turbine that's going to be introduced into an area, and so you want to get an impact assessment of how many are going to be in that area next year, in which case the environmental uncertainty about what the conditions are going to be like and those environmental covariates should be part of your uncertainty on how many are going to be there. Or are you interested in, for example, predicting some long-term averaging over the environmental uncertainty, in which case that environmental uncertainty shouldn't be part of the output? So it's rather complicated, and it requires a lot of clear thinking, starting with what are your questions and what are you going to do with this uncertainty? We've got a lot to say about this, as you can tell. Part of it's in the paper that Dave was referring to that'll be out at some point, and we're happy to talk about it some more, particularly with regulators.
If I can just add one thing, Len, I'll put a note in the chatter for Katrina to put in. Spiegelhalter has a really nice paper in Science 2011 on visualizing uncertainty. A different context, of course, but a lot of regulatory decisions were going into that, and how do you show that to the audience?
Great.
Thanks. So I've got a question I think that Jason is going to answer, and maybe with some input from Len laterally. So you always talk about data coming from line transects, distance sampling, etc. What about data coming from ad lib surveys, for example, where there's no transects or no fixed routes? Are the detection function models still valid and calculable? Over to you, Jason.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a pretty common question to come up. And the answer is, I guess I would say it depends. So when it comes to this question, we have it, I think we have a question both involving detectability modeling and the spatial modeling. So we'll start with the detectability modeling one. And so for this, we kind of need to go back to the basic assumptions of distance sampling. So first of all, in order for the data to be usable under this framework, distances to sightings need to be collected, first of all, in order to fit a detection function. If this is not possible, you could potentially use a proxy from some other study that used a similar method. But again, that will bring in additional uncertainty. Observer effort should be tracked as the study proceeds, so it's known when observers were actually observing and when they were not observing. Observers need to not be given any prior knowledge of when the animals, might be there or might not be there. And ideally, the transects would be laid out, in an unbiased manner with respect to where the animals actually are. That affects the spatial model perhaps a bit more than the detection model. Len, do you want to comment further on this? I guess
Thanks.
With respect to the detectability question specifically.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I just wanted to point out that, so what a lot of you've been talking about, Jason, has been in this kind of aspect of design-based versus model-based, and the fact that under some circumstances we can use these non-designed platforms of opportunity or whatever. But the other thing to think about, I think, is actually what's happening on the boat and what data are recorded on the boat as to whether the data are usable or not. And so there's a hierarchy there from people who are doing effectively a line transect survey, but from a platform of opportunity, they're collecting distances and all those kinds of things, down to below that, they're doing the same kind of thing, but they're not collecting distances, or we don't have the distances. And in that case, you might be able to use the detection functions that you fitted in another context to correct the encounters to get a local density and then do density surface modeling. Through to a case where people were doing surveying, but you don't know anything about their detection function, and there's no data at all, in which case, if you've got enough of those data, you can fit that to get a density surface, and you can fit your line transect data to get a density surface, and they should be parallel to one another, but there's going to be an unknown calibration constant. And this is the kind of thing that Tina also was sort of battling with acoustics, that we can get a relative density surface from acoustics, perhaps if we assume that the Q rate is constant over time, because we don't, in some cases we don't know detectability, in other cases we do. And so then it becomes a calibration exercise. And then at the sort of the bottom of the hierarchy, as it were, are the cases where we just have observations and we don't have any effort. And that's the kind of thing that, for example, the Pinniped guys were working with. And then they had to come up with some proxy for effort to be able to use those data at all. So there's the is it designed or is it platform opportunity side of things to think about. But then there's also, very importantly, the what do the actual data on that's been collected tell you about local density? Jason, does that cover the kind of thing that you were thinking of?
Yeah. Now maybe we should bounce to the second version of this question, which kind of concerns the spatial model. Rob, do you want to go with that?
Yeah, are we going to the data integration question? So
Okay.
Question about data integration, yes?
I think we were on question 7.
I'm missing that, sorry, I'm looking at the data integration one.
Okay.
I've got it here, or you maybe go for it. Ask your own question, Jason.
Okay, all right. So someone asks, I was wondering how sensitive density surface models are to non-systematic data collection, provided that a comprehensive range of environmental conditions are surveyed. So this is another, kind of widely asked question. So I guess what I'd say is, non-systematic designs will yield heterogeneous sampling in space and time, and that's really what's motivating this question. And the purpose of the model is, in some sense, to kind of handle this by fitting smooth relationships to the covariates. And so it's really kind of a model transferability question. To some degree, the model will handle situations where you've kind of like oversampled, right? It's not going to necessarily overweight areas where things have been sampled. You'll just improve confidence there. But in ranges where covariates are poorly sampled or not sampled at all, then the methodology won't allow you to somehow magically evade the problem. And the model relationships could be, uncertain or even incorrect. And so I guess what I would emphasize is, ideally, the surveys should be conducted in transects laid out, independent of the known presence or absence of animals. So if possible, don't just use data that's collected, towards known aggregations of animals. That will definitely bias the results. But if there is some heterogeneity in space or time, but you have good sampling of environmental covariates, and you believe that the relationship that you get with those covariates can transfer to other places and times, that's an assumption that you have to make. Then yes, it can work. Gwen, do you want to elaborate on that further?
I would, but Katrina's telling me that we're out of time.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, I think we could go on answering questions for quite a while yet. We've got a few more, but I am aware that we have been running for 2.5 hours, and we said we would finish at 1:30, or I've lost track of what time it is around the world, but 1:30 Eastern time. So I am going to say thank you very much to everyone for attending. I thank you very much to all the presenters. We will be in touch with details, as I said, of where this will be posted. We'll also try to answer all the questions that didn't get answered, and I'll tell you about where those answers will be as well. That might be alongside the recording. We'll answer the questions that we didn't get to. So we will try and address everything, all the points that you've raised, and we'll try and make the presentations available as well. So thank you very much for your attendance and your concentration for 2.5 hours. It's quite a lot to take in. So thank you very much to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.